He takes you inside the world of global finance in his memoir, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is an hour, 15 minutes.
I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the owners here at Politics and Prose. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce John Perkins on the occasion of the publication of the paperback of his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is a book that really kind of snuck up on us. It was published about 2 years ago by a very high-quality business book publisher, Barrett Kohler, out on the West Coast. We started stocking a couple of copies. 2 or 3 months later, we were stocking a half dozen copies. A month later, we were stocking a dozen copies. And then it was a true word-of-mouth book that just kept growing and growing. And then to everybody's surprise, but not the surprise of the people who had read the book, all of a sudden there it was on the New York Times bestseller list. So it's the kind of thing, growth of a book that we like to see in the book business. It's hardly propelled by big corporate advertising. It was a true word-of-mouth book. Okay, John Perkins was born of good, solid New England stock. He went to Middlebury College. He graduated with all that right kind of altruism, idealism. He had an uncle by marriage who worked for the National Security Agency, who suggested to him that he go into the Peace Corps, which seemed exactly the right path for a young man who was idealistic. And he did. He went to the Amazon. It was something that just fired his imagination. So the great question for all of us, which we're going to hear about tonight, is how can a young man who starts out with such high ideals be seduced and subverted into a career that involves a lot of subterfuge, deviousness, and just a lot of activities that he would never, I think, 10 years earlier have ever said that he was going to be involved in. Then once he got into it, he was told that there was no way that he was going to get out of it. He couldn't get out of it unless that he was going to risk his life. Well, he did get out of it. And he lived to tell the tale, and this is the tale that he tells. It's a world which very few of us know. We're going to hear all tonight about what an economic hitman is. It's not a pretty story, but it will make a lot of things that you read in our newspapers about what is going on in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Indonesia, it will make a lot more sense. So here's John Perkins to tell us all about this. And I should say one more thing, and that is now he's come full circle. He's back to working in the Amazon. He's working with indigenous peoples there to help them preserve their cultures against the inroads of the oil companies who are coming in, trying in whatever way they can. And John Perkins knows all the tactics because he's used them in the past. But he's there now to preserve rather than to spoil. So here's John Perkins.
Thank you. Did you want this? Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Politics and Prose. It's great to be at an independent bookseller. And thank you, all of you. It's deeply touching to see so many of you standing around out there. I'm very gratified and feel very honored to be here with you tonight. I feel especially moved by being in this capital city, and yesterday I spent some time wandering around the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial and other places, and I've always been tremendously touched by what Thomas Jefferson had to say, and Tom Paine and others. And as I wandered around this great city yesterday, seeing these places and reading the inscriptions, I was so deeply moved at what an incredible opportunity you and I, each of us here, has right now, because we're at a time that's not unlike the 1770s, when the world is on the verge of a new revolution, and we're going to lead it into that revolution and make this a better world for my daughter and all of her brothers and sisters on every continent on this planet. And I'm very hopeful that we'll do that. And seeing all of you here tonight gives me great, great hope. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Deviation from the script here. The book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, basically covers world history from World War II until post 9/11. And tonight I'm really going to focus on 4 points about that history and also leave some time for questions and answers. So I'll try to move rapidly through this. But those points are: 1, since World War II, we've managed to create history's first truly global empire. 2, this has been done by the corporatocracy, which are a few men and even a fewer women who run our major corporations, and in doing so also run the United States government and many other governments around the world. The corporatocracy has created this world empire primarily in secret. Most of us haven't been aware of it because it's been done through economics rather than, like most other empires, through the military. The military only comes in as a last resort. 3, we in the United States have managed to go against all of our own principles in this process, and we've turned what people at the end of World War II saw as the great savior of democracy, the United States, into an empire that's feared by millions of people around the planet. Those are the bad 3 points. The 4th point is the good news. The good news is that today we find ourselves living in a highly integrated planet, a highly interconnected world, and we have all of the resources at our disposal necessary to bring peace and prosperity to future generations. So tonight, I'd like to focus on the good news. The fourth, I'm an economist, so I don't count too well. It's a benefit, you know, if you're an economist, don't learn to count. Tonight we will focus on the good news, on the smart, realistic, and pragmatic things each of us can do, you and I, what each of us can do to turn this world around. When you leave here, I believe you will feel absolutely confident that we, you and I, will do the right thing, and that together in the next few years, we will become the kind of country that our children will be proud to inherit from us. I think we have the prospect to do it, and we're going to do it. And I would just like to mention that I started talking about this book last November, a year ago, a little over a year ago, when the hardback came out. And I saw very different faces. People were not nearly as aware a year ago as we are today with what's going on with the National Security Agency, the agency that trained me, and the exposure about them spying on our own people, what we know about Latin America, and so many other things. Things have changed a lot in this last year, and I take complete credit for it. Before I go into this good news that I see coming, I'd like to address some questions that I'm sure a lot of you have. It's, how did we get here? How did this happen? And how did it happen so secretly? And what are economic hitmen anyway? And where do they come from? And of course, all of these things are addressed in lots of detail in the book, so I ought to stop talking now and let you buy the book. But I'll go into it a little bit. As Barbara mentioned, I was recruited by the National Security Agency, the NSA, into becoming an economic hitman, and by an amazing woman named Claudine, who's described in detail in the book, trained me and brought me into the system. And then I worked for a private corporation, which is the way it's done now. Can everybody hear me, incidentally? Yes, good. Which is the way it's done now. It's so that there won't be any blame assigned to the U.S. government. The way economic hitmen work in general, we do many different things, but perhaps if there's one that's most typical, it's that we identify a third world country that has resources that we covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan from an organization like the World Bank or one of its sisters here in town for that third world country. Most of the money for that loan, in most cases, does not go to that country. It goes directly to a U.S. corporation, ones we hear about a lot these days, like Bechtel and Halliburton. That company then builds a large infrastructure project in the country, hydroelectric plants, energy grids, ports, industrial parks, things that serve the very rich and usually don't help the poor at all. But these are things that leave the country holding a huge debt, so huge, in fact, that it can't possibly repay it, and that's by intent. That's what I did for a living. So that at some point we economic hitmen can go back to this country and say, look, you owe us a lot of money, you can't repay your debts, so do us a favor, a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheaply to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical UN vote, or send troops in support of ours someplace in the world, like Iraq. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the way this works, and then we'll move on to the good news, just so you understand. But for example, in Panama, and I talk about this in detail in the book, but in Panama, I was sent down to bring Omar Torrijos around. Torrijos was the first president of Panama that was really popular among the people following about 50 years, the whole history of Panama, of puppet dictatorships. And I was sent down to bring him around, and he invited me to a little bungalow outside Panama City. He said, look, I know the game you're playing, and I know that if I play the game with you, I'll become fabulously rich. But that's not my interest. I want to help my poor people. I'm not making Omar out to be an angel. He wasn't an angel, but he did want to help his poor people. So he said, you can either get the hell out of my country or play the game my way. Well, I went back to my bosses in Boston, and we agreed that I should stay there. After all, as long as I was there, I might bring him around. We could make a little money in the process. And so I stayed there, but Omar was in a very special position because he was renegotiating or trying to renegotiate the Panama Canal Treaty with the United States to turn the canal over to his people. And so the whole world was watching this man. Everybody everywhere, especially in the third world, was watching this man. And I knew that if Omar didn't come around, if I failed as an economic hitman, then the jackals would step in. And the jackals are what we called CIA-sanctioned operatives that try to overthrow governments or assassinate the leaders. There's a long history of this, as most of you know. We economic hitmen don't fail very often, but when we do, we know the jackals are there in the shadows. And sure enough, I failed, and Omar was assassinated. His plane was blown up in the air. That's one example. A second example is Saudi Arabia. As a few of you I see from looking at your faces, there are a few of you here who remember the early 70s, as I do, when OPEC decided to shut off oil to us. They didn't like our policies in Israel. So they cut down our oil supplies, and we had long lines of cars waiting at the gas stations. Remember that? Yeah. And we were afraid that we were going to have another depression like in the 30s. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and a few other economic hitmen and said, look, you got to devise a plan so that this can never happen again. We can't be blackmailed by a bunch of Middle Eastern sheikdoms. And we knew that the key to any such plan had to rest with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia controlled more oil than anybody else, and the House of Saud, the royal family, was corruptible. And so to make a long story short, the long version's in the book, but the short version is we reached a plan whereby Saudi Arabia would reinvest almost all the money it made from selling oil to the world, would invest that in U.S. government securities. The interest from those government securities would go to the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department would hire U.S. corporations to rebuild Saudi Arabia. Petrochemical plants, desalination plants, power grids, highways, in fact, complete cities out of the desert that would be westernized. And in fact, that worked very well. Part of the plan also was that Saudi Arabia would guarantee to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to us, and we would guarantee the continued rule of the House of Saud. Plan worked very, very well in Saudi Arabia, we thought. Of course, we know now this what the CIA calls blowback, made Osama bin Laden very angry, made a lot of Arabs and Muslims around the world very angry to have their most sacred sites surrounded by petrochemical plants and McDonald's. So there has been blowback. But at the time, it seemed like a great success. We thought we would implement the same policy in Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein had been put into power by us. As a lot of you probably know, there was a very popular president of Iraq named Qassam, who decided that the Iraqis should benefit more from the oil produced by their countries, and so he threatened to either tax or nationalize foreign oil companies. We decided we needed to get rid of him. We hired a young high school student and his team to assassinate Qassam. The high school student failed, was slightly wounded. His name was Saddam Hussein. So the CIA went directly and captured Qassam and had him executed publicly on Iraqi television, put Saddam Hussein's family, his cousin, in charge. Saddam was a vice president in charge of security who eventually rose to president. During the 80s, we economic hitmen went in and we sold him or gave him or loaned him a lot of jets, a lot of tanks. We built chemical plants for him that we knew full well were being used to produce chemical weapons that were used against the Iranians and the Kurds. We knew this. We also then tried to get Saddam to buy the same deal that the Saudis had bought, but he wouldn't buy. If he had bought, he'd still be head of that country and we'd be building him chemical plants. But he didn't. So we sent in the jackals. The jackals failed with Saddam. He had too good a security forces, too many double lookalikes. They couldn't get through to him. So he sent in the military in '91. Now, the military could have taken Saddam out at the time, but didn't want to. We didn't want to get rid of Saddam. He's the kind of guy we like, you know, we economic hitmen. He's a strong man. He was a good buffer against Iran. And if we thought he'd been sufficiently chastised by us destroying his military, that in the 90s he would come around. Economic hitmen went back in. He didn't come around. Jackals went back in. They couldn't take him out. So we sent the military in once again. Why I tell these two stories, three really, Panama, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, is that Panama demonstrates the first step when economic hitmen fail, the jackals go in. Saudi Arabia demonstrates what happens when the economic hitmen succeed, which is the most common. And Iraq demonstrates what happens when both the economic hitmen and the jackals fail, then the military goes in. Then and only then. And I would just like to point out that today, this very moment, this is going on in Latin America. As many of you know, 80% of South America's population, over 80%, representing 7 countries, in their most recent elections voted in the president who ran on a very strong anti-US, anti-World Bank, anti-IMF policy. Latin America sent us a very strong message. The most recent is Evo Morales of Bolivia. And as soon as those men become elected president, Evo Morales right now has an economic hitman, or did yesterday, or will tomorrow, or both days, walks into his office and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President. I just want you to know that in this briefcase over here, I've got a couple of $100 million for you and your family if you play our game. In this briefcase over here, I've got a gun with a bullet with your name on it if you decide to keep your campaign promises." He whispers into his ear, "Remember what happened to Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Salvador Allende of Chile. Remember what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala and Torrijos of Panama and Noriega. And remember what happened to Qassam of Iraq and Mossadegh of Iran, and on and on and on." And these guys know. It's a terribly difficult position. I'll tell you, the pressure that's being put on Evo Morales right now, and Néstor Kirchner of Argentina, and Lula of Brazil, and of course we all know a little bit about Chavez. The pressure is phenomenal that's being put on these people. Anyway, they're here. At last. They're hiding behind the books. They always hide behind words, you know? Well, I really don't want to dwell here tonight on the negative, and I've been talking a lot about the negative. Rather, I want to convince you that together we can change this situation, and we must change this situation. The key to transforming this situation is the power base of the corporatocracy, and that is the corporations. We must change our corporations. I have a few statistics to read to you here. With the help of government policies, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, foreign aid, and other institutions, our corporations manage to funnel 25% of the world's resources to 5% of the world's population, us living in the United States. And of course, a very small percentage of that 5% benefits the most. As a result, 24,000 people die every single day from starvation. Another 30,000, mostly children, die from curable diseases because we don't get them the medicines. More than half the world's population survives on less than $2 a day, not enough to provide the basic amenities that pre-Civil War plantation owners gave to their slaves. It's sad to say, but our corporations today do a great deal to keep wages very, very low. Their sweatshop workers receive less than those slaves. $2 a day doesn't buy you room and board in most of these countries, but the slaves get room and board. You and I are the beneficiaries of these policies, at least materialistically. Morally, we suffer deeply. And our children will suffer materialistically, and our grandchildren. The violence that swept through the World Trade Center and parts of Washington and the violence in Iraq today are just the first shots across the bow unless we do something. We absolutely must transform the corporations because they're the power base. To do so, we have to first recognize that these corporations are extremely vulnerable. Corporations are extremely vulnerable. Every one of us needs to understand that corporations are completely dependent on us. We buy everything they make. And many of us work for them in one capacity or another, either as employees or as consultants or in some capacity. Furthermore, every single corporation is led by people who are worried about the future for their children. I know this for a fact. Well, I don't know every single CEO, but I've met a lot of them. They're all scared. They know about Osama bin Laden. They know what's going on in Latin America better than most of us, and they know that this world is in deep trouble, and they're scared for their children. I'd like to tell you a little anecdotal story here. A few years ago, a major NGO in this country went up against a huge international corporation on issues around forests. And the NGO sent people out to demonstrate against the corporation, hang flags and signs and banners from their office buildings, and do many things to disrupt them. And eventually the big corporation conceded and made a lot of the policy implementations that the NGO had requested. Several months after this, but in the process, the president of the NGO, senior vice president of the big corporation came head to head. They came to blows. They were nasty at each other. It was terrible. A few months after all this ended, I had the good fortune of, of being at a conference in Santa Barbara, California. And on Saturday night of that weekend, I ended up sitting in a hot tub looking out over the Pacific Ocean with the president of the NGO and the senior vice president of the big international corporation. And to top it all off, we were all drinking beer and we were all naked. Now that makes for an interesting evening. I wonder what these two men who'd been stranglehold with each other for so long were going to do. And after a few beers and sitting there in that hot tub, the senior vice president of the big corporation said to the president of the NGO, "I want to thank you." Sends goosebumps up me. "I want to thank you for what you did." He said, "For many years, I felt strongly for my children and for everybody else that my corporation needed to be a better environmental steward, but I didn't feel I could do anything about it. I would have lost my job and been replaced by someone worse than me. When you and your people demonstrated against us, you sent the word to management. Then I could go out and push for real reforms. These corporations are very, very vulnerable. That's just one story. They're all equally as vulnerable. Who remembers, what was the corporation that instigated the overthrow of Salvador Allende of Chile? Anybody? ITT. What's it doing today? You never heard of it today. Doesn't exist. Bethlehem Steel doesn't exist. U.S. Steel doesn't exist. Pan American doesn't exist. Enron doesn't exist. Corporations are very, very vulnerable. We must transform them. As Barbara mentioned, I've also done a lot of work with indigenous people in the Amazon and other places, and one of the things we like to do there that helps to promote transformation is something that's called a journey, sometimes called, well, I don't want to use the word shaman because that scares a lot of people, but I would like to invite you now to take a little guided journey with me. It'll be very short and very easy. I'll walk you right through it. So if you just might close your eyes for a minute, just relax a little bit. And I want you to envision the modern corporation. So if you close your eyes, and what I'd like you to see is an octopus sitting on the United States. Its tentacles are reaching all around the planet to the very most remote corners of the planet. And it's using those tentacles to suck up resources from all over the planet. Feel what it would feel like for just a moment to be a peasant, a very poor person at the end of one of these tentacles, providing the resources that this octopus is sucking up to bring back to the United States. Just feel that for a moment. And feel the power of this great octopus, which is bringing all these resources for us here that we can live these very sumptuous materialistic lives. And then think about, at the top of that octopus, there's a man who's making probably about 500 times the salary that his average employee is making. Just in salary. He has a lot more than that in assets. He's benefiting the most from all these resources being sucked up. And now I'd like you just to see the reverse, an alternative. There's that octopus is still there with all those tentacles reaching to the farthest corners of the planet, but it's sending resources out along those tentacles, primarily in the form of educating people about how to provide themselves with the basic amenities, and through health services, including family planning. It supports democratically elected officials, even those who suggest that revenues from local resources like oil be used to help local populations. In fact, this octopus, this alternative octopus, fights to implement trade rules aimed at using local resources to help local populations rather than making people in another country wealthier. It provides microcredit and training to fishermen, farmers, and family-run businesses of all kinds, small businesses. It defines its most important objective as being a good citizen, serving employees, clients, consumers, and the communities where they live. It plans for the long run and is a steward of the environment. Every decision this corporation makes is based on the recognition that everything on this planet is interdependent. Feel how that feels, to be part of that octopus. And the man and woman sitting at the top make a reasonable salary, but not one that's totally out of line with what everybody else makes. Feel that. Now when you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes and come back to reality. That is reality. That is the reality that we're going to create here. These two visions may seem diametrically opposed, but I think rather that they represent an evolutionary process, one that must happen. That second step is one that we have to take if we are going to survive on this planet as a species in the way that we know survival. We absolutely must do it. We must transform the corporations. And as a matter of fact, that second vision isn't all that new. My grandfather ran a small furniture store in New Hampshire, and his primary goal in life was to serve his community. Yes, he made some money for his family to eat and live in a decent home, but his primary concern was community service. And he was not unusual. In those days, many, many small businesses, at least where I came from in New Hampshire, were run with that in mind. What's required here for us then is a change of consciousness, and one that's not out of line with corporate history or with our own history. It's a change of consciousness that helps us define and helps the corporation, helps us to insist that the corporation define as its goal not the betterment for a few select people at the top, the wealth of them, immense wealth, but rather that defines the corporation's goal as being to serve the community. So, we come down to you, each and every one of us. What can you do? What can I do? Well, in the book, I have a long laundry list of things that people can do, but it really depends on each of us. I'm a writer. There's certain things I can do. If you're a lawyer, you could do something else. A teacher would do something else. A plumber, a massage therapist. We all have different things that we excel in, and we all have different things that draw our hearts, and we must look to those ultimately for what it is we need to do. But there's a few things that all of us can and must do. The first, I think, and I'm not putting these in any particular order, but it's to redefine what it is to be human on this planet and to replace the idea of short-term greed with long-term responsibility. We have to insist that our children stop honoring people like Donald Trump, whose biggest goal in life is to say you're fired. We have to replace these people with heroes that are doing things for community. We must shop consciously, second thing. Fair trade coffee and other fair trade items. Fish that are abundant, not those that are going extinct. And please, a lot of you aren't going to like this one. Don't buy water from the Alps or Fiji. You know, it's not organic if it's coming a long way in trucks or airplanes or trains. Even if it comes from California. There's a lot of good things locally. We need to use local water. Make it better if that's what has to happen. Recycle. Greenwich, Connecticut. Well, that's not too far away. Recycle paper and wood, fuel-efficient cars and appliances. Buy everything from no-sweat factories. You go to Google and go to non-sweat products, and you'll find how you know whether your T-shirt's been made in a sweatshop that pays $2 a day, slave labor or not. Live consciously. You know, we all need to be aware that everything we do connects with everybody else on the whole planet, not just around us. Support nonprofits that make a difference. There's a lot of great nonprofits here. I founded one, and its director's here with me tonight, Dream Change. You can go to dreamchange.org. But there's a lot of fantastic nonprofits that are doing great work. Educate yourself and others. You know, if there's one thing I saw as I walked around Washington yesterday at the Jefferson Memorial and Lincoln Memorial and other places, it was all about education. It's about understanding. Democracy depends on an educated electorate. Question your political and business leaders. Write letters and emails. Vote consciously. Come together and form communities and support each other. It's easy for us to sit back and proclaim that the problems are too large, the corporatocracy too powerful. But you know what? That's just a cop-out. Thank God our forefathers back in the 1770s didn't say, oh, the King of England's too powerful. The biggest army in the whole world that represents the largest empire in the whole world and happens to be my government, it's too powerful. I can't stand up to it. I can't do anything about it. Thank God Thomas Jefferson, who sits over there in the Jefferson Memorial, had the gall, had the courage to stick his neck in a noose because he was a traitor, he was a terrorist. He went against this government and would have been hanged if we'd lost the war, as would George Washington, for whom this town is named. Thank God they had the courage. Thank God my father had the courage to fight Hitler and beat him. Thank God my parents and grandparents had the courage to make it through the Great Depression. Those were tough times. We've got it easy by comparison. All we got to do is change the corporations. That's easy. It's just how we shop, and work. I'd like to just end now with a few examples of, and then we'll open it to questions and answers, of some people who have made a difference that I would like to honor. And this year, just this last month, we celebrated the death of Eugene McCarthy. There's an inspiration, whether you believe in his policies or not. There's a man who probably can take as much credit as anyone for bringing down perhaps the most powerful president in the United States in modern times, Lyndon Johnson, and bringing an end to the Vietnam War and bringing down Nixon also. There's a man and all of his followers who really created change. Rosa Parks. I grew up in rural New Hampshire. I had no idea that blacks were not allowed to ride on the front of a bus until Rosa Parks showed me that. She changed the world. She not only changed the United States' attitude towards integration, but she changed South Africa's attitude and many, many other countries. Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring and taught us about chemical pollution. 100 years ago, you women couldn't have voted in this country. Today you can. It may not count, but we're going to change that too. Think of what we've done in the areas of pollution. Rivers were on fire 30 years ago. Acid rain has really decreased tremendously. Aerosol emissions. We've saved a lot of endangered species. The Kyoto Protocol has been rejected by our government, but it's been accepted by over 200 cities in this country. There's so much that we've done. SUV sales have gone down by 50% this year, and hybrid sales are going up. There are many things we can do. And in this last year, the number of books, in addition to Confessions of an Economic Hitman, there have been a lot of other great books that have come out telling the truth. Look at the movies, The Constant Gardener, Hotel Rwanda, Syriana, Good Night, Good Luck, Munich. There's no excuse for anybody not to be educated and not to be aware at this point. And I'd like to make one final special appeal to all of you who, like me, are over 50. I'm well over 50. We've reached this point in life when we've had it really pretty good, and I think we've been a pretty selfish generation, really. And do we really want to retire to play golf or read books all the time? No, I think 1 or 2 days a week of golf ought to be satisfactory for anybody. We are what I like to call entering the age of mastery, and I think Gail Sheehan coined that phrase. We're really here. We don't need to worry about making a living probably anymore. We don't need to worry about our children in terms of providing them with educations, but we do need to worry about the world they're entering. Please, I beg of you, if you're over 50, start thinking, and if you're over 60, as I am, really think about what you can do for the rest of your life to make this world a better place. That's what you're going to enjoy. That's a lot more fun than playing golf, I guarantee it. But you can do a little of the golf, too. So enlist yourself in whatever movement appeals to you, how you can do this. Now, this is just about the end, but I'd just like to ask you to close your eyes for just a moment again. And I'd like you to envision something that you can do to change the world. And see what impact this is going to have when you do this. Something that draws your heart. And look at the impact. Something that will make this world a better place. What can you do? And make a commitment to doing it right now. Make a commitment. Okay. You can open your eyes, and a lot of you are already standing up. Those who are sitting down, I'd like to ask you to stand up for a moment. It's good to stretch for a moment before we go into questions and answers. And turn to somebody. Well, stand up first. Got to get you on your feet. And turn to somebody now and share your commitment with that person, the commitment you just made.
Yeah, me too. Me too. A little bit of that too. I committed to.
I have Hans.
Right. I kind of committed to like drive my use less, gas, drive my.
Okay.
That's cheating too, 'cause it's not working.
Okay, let's bring this to a close. Oh, stay on your feet, please. Stay on your feet. Bring this to a close. Now I'd like you in the front to turn toward the back, and you in the back to turn toward the front, and give yourselves that big hand for this commitment you've made. Okay, now you can sit down. Somebody pointed out to me that that's a pretty cheap method for getting a standing ovation. I guess I'll have a few more words to say at the end, but let's do some questions. So we'll get the questions will come from this microphone over here, and then the answers will come from over here someplace, okay? Yes.
Thanks for your book, and thanks for being here tonight. Hello? Thank you for your book, and thanks for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. My question is about the drug war. It seems to be empowering the adversaries of the corporatocracy, and if you buy into the corporatocracy, it seems like they wouldn't want to have this drug war. Can you make a comment about how the drug war fits into this?
Are you referring to the drug war in Colombia or the United States or around the world? Or
around the world.
Around the world. Well, I think in general, in most foreign countries, the drug war really plays into the hands of the corporatocracy. For example, Colombia, which I know personally very well, the war against drugs there has been used as an excuse to provide huge militaries, private militaries, which we say are being used against drug traffickers, but in fact, in many cases, in most of the cases that I know of, they're being used to protect oil companies and the big pipeline that goes across the Andes. This is also beginning to happen in Ecuador and in Peru, and I suspect in many places around the world. So often the whole drug war idea is an excuse to get money into the hands of paramilitaries that are, in fact, defending corporate interests.
How about the Taliban?
What about them?
In Afghanistan, the poppies are higher than before the Taliban were there, and
You mean higher priced?
no, higher production.
Oh, higher production. Well, yeah, but of course, during a period of time, all that poppy production was destroyed. Now, poppies are not a problem for the people of Afghanistan. They're a source of income. And, the people there would make the point that if we want to get rid of our drug problems in this country, we need to do that, but not at the expense of their primary crop. That point has also been made in Bolivia. It's one of the things that Evo Morales ran on, is that the United States was implementing a policy to destroy the coca plants there. And coca is a very important product in Bolivia, not just for cocaine, but for many, many different medicinal uses. I've used it often in the Andes for altitude sickness, for example. It has no connection to cocaine. And the people of Bolivia are saying, why should the United States destroy one of our primary crops because the U.S. has a drug problem? We don't have that problem here. We need the coca plant. Thanks. Yeah.
Hello. Sorry.
Hi.
Can everybody hear me? And not to make you or anyone in the room feel old, but my mother's water broke in one of those gas station lines in the 90s. Totally making that up. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, really? That's such a beautiful story.
My father and I have both just finished your book, and I remember being a teenager. I remember growing up and going on and on in debates with him about, the world's so messed up. What can I do about it? And him suggesting, you should get out there, you should march, you should do whatever. And then we recently had the same conversation, and I'm not saying it's a direct result of your book. And I said the same complaints, and he said, and I said, anytime someone stands up, King, Torrijos, Malcolm X, Kennedy's, they die. So what's the point? Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, you're probably right. And I'm not. My point is, your book is so powerful in showing how powerful the corporatocracy is. And how do you turn around right after reading it and say, I'm going to do something is the Peace Corps really effective anymore? Can you really make long-term impact
Yes.
without them winning, basically?
It's an extremely important question that you've asked here. And it's why I say I think that the way to turn this around is that we have to take away the power base, which is the corrupt use of corporations, what I would like to call the corrupt use of corporations. Because assassination has been incredibly important. It's been important in this. I had a jackal. I met with one just a couple of months ago since this book came out, and he pointed out to me that assassination has also been very important in the United States. Jack Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, think of all the black movement people, including Martin Luther King, John Lennon. A lot of senators have died in airplane crashes, not just Wellstone that everybody knows about. And in fact, it serves to scare people that are thinking about doing something for reform. And Latin America, as I mentioned earlier, sent this very strong message. Only we can change that. The Latin Americans have sent a strong message. They have these presidents now who are having tremendous pressure. We here in the United States must stand up to our government and our corporations and say, you have to honor those democracies. It doesn't matter if they want to get the money from the oil for their own people. We've got to honor them. We've got to insist upon this. We must stand up and insist upon it. It's the leaders, in most cases, who will be assassinated or threatened. But all of us need to stand up and put our arms around, form circles, literal circles, and emotional and figurative circles around these people and protect them. And some will be assassinated. I'm often asked if I fear for my life in this process. And the question is, it's almost irrelevant to me because I'm 60, I'm about to turn 61. I have a 23-year-old daughter. I did some awful things in this world. I helped to create this situation. I don't know how many days I've got left or years before I'm lying on my deathbed. It could end tonight. But what I do know is when I'm on that deathbed, I want to look back and say, I did everything I could to turn this around, to have retribution against myself, in fact, to redeem myself and to make this a better world. We must be courageous. We mustn't fear. Doing nothing is the most dangerous thing of all. Think of our heroes in history, all these men that surround us in this city, Tom Paine and Jefferson and Washington, all of them stuck their heads in nooses. And we come from a tremendous tradition, and we see war monuments there that say freedom depends upon our soldiers fighting in Germany during World War II, which it did, and it also depends on us now being willing to risk our lives. You must be willing to risk your life. You and I and all of us must be willing to risk our lives for a bigger cause, as long as we know we truly believe in that cause. Thank you.
Do us all a favor and stay off of private jets. Don't give them a cover story, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had the privilege of reading your book last year in a graduate course in development economics. I thought you should know that's being read on college campuses for that purpose.
Great.
And maybe it was because I read too much theory, but I really, really enjoyed the writing, and I enjoyed the flow of it, and I think it would make a great screenplay. So I don't know if you're thinking about that, or if any of you here who are thinking of buying the book. It's a great read just for the read, as well as for the message, and I hope to see it someday on the big screen.
Thank you. A film company has bought the rights, and a major actor who I'm not supposed to mention right now, but bears a slight resemblance to me, I've been told, is behind that. So, but who knows what'll happen, And back to the young man that was before you, I just wanted to mention that nobody invites me to ride on private jets anymore.
Hello, everyone hear me? I just want to say that I really enjoyed your book. Read it last year, couldn't wait. Heard you on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, and had to pick up the book. And I have a two-pronged question. The first question is about Hugo Chavez, and how do you, I don't know if you know him personally, but how do you think he's dealing with the stress, and how much stress do you might you know about that he's going through? Because, I mean, even Pat Robertson has a target on him, so we know he's in trouble. And the second prong is the fact about the media's complicity and the fact that a lot of people just don't know how much we do.
Yeah. Great questions, both of them. Hugo Chavez, he's read the book too, and it's in Spanish, it's in 20 other languages now. And he's contacted me, asked me to be on television with him. I didn't go for some other reasons, but and I don't approve of a lot of things Hugo Chavez does. He's not. I mean, but he's a democratically elected president, and he's very, very popular. He's winning huge mandates, and he's standing up to us, and he's doing some great things, and he's financing some amazing movements in Latin America too. You know, Argentina just dropped all of its debt to the IMF, paid it all off, $10 billion, because they didn't want to be beholden to the IMF anymore, and instead Hugo Chavez is absorbing that debt. He's giving them the money to move forward. I think tremendously of him in that regard. And I think he's got enormous pressure under him. There's no question in my mind that he would be dead by now were it not for Iraq and Afghanistan. We tried to overthrow him, as I'm sure you know, in 2003. We did for about 48 hours or so. But he's very, very popular. He came back. At that point, under the classic system that we have, we would have sent in a much stronger force to do away with him. But because we were so extended in Iraq and Afghanistan, we couldn't. In addition, these 6 other Latin American countries. So in addition to Venezuela, we've got Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia. I think that's 7, is it? Anyway, who have all standing together now. And Brazil is important because it's one of the world's major economies and one of the world's major weapons producers. And these countries now have all formed pacts to protect each other. They've all said that if any one of them is attacked by us in any way, they will stand together. And in a way, the war in Iraq has given them the opportunity to do this because it's kept us at bay long enough for them to form these alliances. What's going on in Latin America today, I think, is incredibly significant, and we all ought to listen to it and pay attention and demand of all of our leaders, corporate and political, that they defend those democracies. Thanks for asking that. And the second question was about the media. The media is repulsive, you know. I mean, it just doesn't get the word out, the mainstream media. The reporters are all afraid. If I'm a reporter for the New York Times and I ask the wrong questions at a press conference, I won't be invited back. If I don't get invited back, I won't have a job. I kind of understand where they're coming from. They're owned by the corporatocracy, either directly or through advertising, and they're not getting the word out. My book was on the New York Times bestseller list for, I think, about 20 weeks in total. It's going to be on again next week, I've been pre-informed. And yet, the New York Times never has mentioned it in anything except the bestseller list. The good news is, though, that there is Amy Goodman and Air America and a lot of other alternative press. What I've discovered in this last year is that the word does get out. And the internet is amazingly powerful. Cell phones are powerful. The word is spreading in an amazing way. So in some respects, the mainstream media has become, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, certainly a roadblock to knowledge. We need to get around that. Make sure you get educated, despite the best efforts of your mainstream media to keep you from being educated. Thanks.
Yes.
Hi.
After the 14th Amendment changed my status from property to citizen, United States corporations took their case to the Supreme Court to become legal persons, and United States corporations are federally mandated to make a profit, a huge profit. How do we go about changing or dealing with corporations or addressing their right to get or acquire enormous profits by almost any means? You know?
Yeah. It's an incredibly excellent question. Thank you. You're right. You know, the obligation of corporate executives is to maximize profits for their corporations, for their stockholders, and usually the stockholders, the top stockholders, also happen to be their management in many cases. So that is a legal obligation. We need to change that. We can change that. There's nothing, you know, God didn't mandate that. It's simply our laws that say that. And we need to let our corporations know that we no longer will accept that. You know, if you own stock in a corporation, speak out. If you buy from a corporation, speak out. If you work for a corporation, speak out. We need to change that. We can change that. I think it's a relatively easy thing to change, actually, if we all set our collective minds on doing it, because I also think that an awful lot of the executives at the top really want to see this changed. I don't think they're very happy with the situation that they have, and the ones I talk to and meet with are not. So, but you're absolutely right. There's a big roadblock there, that the corporation as a person, as an entity that has to replicate itself, stay in business, and make a profit. But that's not written in the Ten Commandments, or it wasn't brought down by Muhammad. It's a law we need to get changed, and a whole set of policies that we need to change. Thank you.
To point out on the previous question, the law does mandate maximum return to shareholders, but it does not say over what time frame. And long-term business, some of the things thinking over 10 or 20 years, returns profit within the values you're talking about. I chair an organization locally called Net Impact, which is business professionals for sustainable business, triple bottom line, and there's 500 of us on my list in DC. There's 13,000 people around the world. And so my question to you keep saying our corporations. Remember, the two wonderful women who run this wonderful bookstore are corporate CEOs. This is a corporation. The market isn't going anywhere. Market forces aren't going anywhere. They're neutral. But the people who run them have gone askew or astray or whatever you choose to call it. So the question is, how do we get positive change from within the corporations? You talked about possibly Rain and Home Depot. I don't know if that was your case, but something similar. Folks coming from the outside, but there's a lot of folks moving from the inside within the corporations to try and find, if all other things being equal, if we can do the thing that's more responsible, we're happy to do it, provided we meet the market. So what are some success stories that you've seen from the inside, if any?
Well, thank you. Yes. The greatest encouragement that I take from this is from a lot of those people in middle management, lower management, moving up in management, who are going to all these seminars and conferences on the triple bottom line and sustainability, who want to see things change. I think what they need is for the rest of us to speak out strongly and constantly. Let them know that we support that we want that change. Make those people our heroes. It's interesting to me that when we talk about this triple bottom line, which for those of you who don't know about it, the old bottom line was profits, of course. The triple bottom line is profits, environmental, and social responsibility. And I'm fascinated, having worked a lot with indigenous tribes around the world, that of those three triple bottom lines, the only one that's irrelevant in nature, the only one that indigenous societies don't care about, is profit. Nobody needs to make profit in an indigenous society. You may need to accumulate some things to carry you through a bad season, the rainy season, winter, whatever, but that's not the same as profit. But you do always have to be socially and environmentally responsible. I'm also struck by these meetings of executives on sustainability. Should we become sustainable? I mean, should I take my next breath? I mean, who ever heard of asking a question like that? People throughout history have never asked that question. It was a given that you don't do anything unless it's sustainable. You simply don't do it unless it's better for your children. I don't think that's a tough argument to get across to anybody in any corporation. Let's make this a better world for our children. What stopped the tobacco industry the most? What really stopped the smoking? It wasn't when was pointed out that it hurt our hearts or our lungs or caused cancer. It was when we started talking about secondary smoke and our children. And then the C. Edward Koop, the Surgeon General, bought into that, and that really appealed to people. We need to understand, as I love what you pointed out about the long term, and what does long-term profit mean? It means profit for our children. Maybe we define the whole profit thing so that it's a profit for our children and not necessarily a monetary profit. Money is just a measure of energy. And we need to redefine money. A good friend of mine, Lynn Twist, wrote the book Soul of Money. If you haven't read it, you might want to. It's a great book. And she talks about money as simply being energy. So how we define profit is another approach we can take. We've had a bunch of really good questions, and you two guys maybe ought to get together. And in any case, I mean, you've got to take, this is what, when we close our eyes, what can you do? I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, and I'm going to keep doing that. And you're both a lot younger than me. You're involved in corporations. You understand them. You're working in that process. Make it happen. Make them change. You'll find the way. Once you make that commitment, you will find the way. We will find the way. Thank you.
Hi. I think your book has had a positive impact, but I would have to say I was disappointed in the chapter on Venezuela, which in some particulars is inaccurate and in more important respects is misleading. In particular, the particulars, you seem to have the coup against Chavez occurring sometime in 2003, which could be a typo, but you seem to relate it to and link it to your state of mind and current events in January
Hold up the cover
of 2003.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But so it says
there is a mistake in dates in the book, which has been changed in later editions, including the paperback.
Excellent.
I apologize for that.
Right. But in the more substantive matters, you mentioned you said that Chavez dissolved the Congress, but neglect to mention that the dissolution of the Congress was part of a democratic process in which they had a referendum on whether to have a constituent assembly. They had a constituent assembly. A democratic vote ratified the Constitution, and all of the office holders in Venezuela, including the Congress, including the president, had to then stand for election again under the new Constitution. And in the current environment in which, I mean, I'm sure you've probably seen the cover of Foreign Policy this month, which, calls Hugo Chavez a New Age dictator or some such nonsense. But I think it would have been important to mention that when you say he just dissolved the Congress, it makes it sound like there was some sort of autocratic fascist coup of some sort, when in fact the whole process at every step of the way was ratified by a vote of the Venezuelan people.
Thank you. I certainly meant to imply that Chavez has been constantly ratified by the Venezuelan people. I thought I did that in there. If it didn't do that, I'm sorry for that, because that was certainly my intent. My other intent was not to go into any depth in Venezuela, because I'm a U.S. citizen. The most important thing for me is that my country honor all these other countries when they elect people democratically, whether it be Chavez or Gutierrez of Ecuador or Kirchner of Argentina or whoever, that we honor that. And, I'm not particularly interested in the details behind Chavez in Venezuela or Gutierrez. I'm really interested. Shouldn't I?
Details if you're writing a chapter about it in a best-selling book.
Well, if you read I don't want to get in a sparring match with you, but I think that the point of the chapter was to keep the United States out of interfering in Venezuelan affairs. Thanks.
Hi. In terms of corporate social responsibility and all of that, we're completely disempowered in a lot of senses. And you can say, go and work for a nonprofit, but you can't make a living wage. And you can say, it just seems like go, shopping for certain things. Okay, go buy organic products, but they're a lot more expensive. And so in terms of the young people out there with these ideals, what is your advice to us, is my question.
My advice really is to go with your ideals. My daughter works for a nonprofit. She stopped at a very lucrative job with a public relations firm because she decided that she no longer wanted to represent companies she didn't believe in, and she took a huge cut in salary. But she's a lot happier. She can't buy the same sweater she bought them, but she's a lot happier. I think we have to make our choices here. Yes, food that's produced sustainably or organically is more expensive, but so what? I mean, these are the choices that we need to make. We need to survive as a species, and surviving as a species may mean having a lot fewer clothes, a lot smaller cars, a lot smaller houses, and more expensive food that's grown more consciously. But I think we really need to do that. And what we need to do is really support each other. Your community of young people, support each other in your value system rather than the clothes, the size of the car, and so on. I think you'll find that if you really follow your heart and you follow your conscience, the rest will take care of itself. I know when I was your age, I didn't feel that way either. It's one of the reasons I became an economic hitman. I totally understand where you're coming from. Don't become an economic hitman or woman. But over the years, I've really learned, that if I stick my head in a noose, as I did writing this book, it's probably not going to be lopped off. And if I cut back on things, and as I've done a lot in my life, I'm probably going to get happier, not less happy. I may not have the same material goods. I try to be conscious of every piece of clothes I buy these days and not buy very many, keep recycling and reusing them myself. And I'm happier for it. And I wouldn't have believed that a lot of years ago when I was your age, but try it. And support your friends in that and get them to support you in it. It's a great question, though. It's not easy. Nobody says this is going to be easy. What's that line from Harry Potter? Something about the upcoming world is going to be tough, and we can choose either the easy route or the right route. Let's choose the right route. Are we coming to an end?
Well, let me just say one thing, okay? We've been going now about 15 minutes over the time that we've kind of allotted for it, so we are beginning to wind down. I'm going to say 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to shut down for this evening. I'm sorry to do it, but it's too many people standing in the back. But thanks. Let's go with the other 2.
Hi, I speak as someone who went with my heart and did idealistic things for 20 years, and now I'm sitting here in Washington looking at all the latest materials on things like data mining. Since you have some familiarity with the NSA, I wonder if you could say something about how we can make things like data mining work for the people. When I see that the average person doesn't have a LexisNexis password and investigative journalists are going one Google search at a time, it's kind of like giving them a pea shooter to root out corruption. With the kind of stuff that's available, a situation like Enron has to be pretty readily apparent if you're using proper data mining equipment. Do you have any insight in how this could be improved?
Well, I think again, I'm certainly not an expert in that field at all. It sounds like you know more about it than I do, and you ought to get deeply involved. But stay committed, read as much as you can, and go into it with a vengeance. Yes, we need that, and yes, it does work. Enron, look what happened to Enron and Anderson and WorldCom and a bunch of other companies like that. And we are now exposing what the NSA is doing in terms of listening to my telephone and perhaps yours. I know they're listening to mine. They're probably listening to all of us. I think things like this are beginning to come out more. And of course, the more that happens and the more we as a people support it and ask for it to happen more, and the more that we honor those who do it, the stronger it becomes, and the more it becomes. We mustn't give up. We must keep pushing for this over and over and over again. Again, it's I suppose for me having this book go to the top of the list is an ego trip to a certain degree. But more than anything, what it says to me is that despite the fact that the media blackballed me and continue to, my publicist felt totally confident that when this book came out with Penguin in paperback, suddenly the mainstream media was going to invite me in. They haven't. Surprise. But you're here. I mean, we've got a pretty good-sized crowd here tonight. And, there's a lot of other people buying the book and listening, and this is happening with so many books and so many movies. The word is getting out there, and we need to just keep pushing for it. I think maybe you need to write your book. Thank you.
I'd like to commend you for the work you've done, particularly showing the American public how deeply evil the people who run this country have been willing to stoop. It's very hard for a lot of people to really face how evil our leaders have chosen to become. I'm active on the 9/11 issue, and most of the respected people in the movement, in the peace movement, won't even give proper respect to that. I'm going to ask you how, what your knowledge is if you've looked at the issues involved with claiming that there's a cover-up. I'll ask one very specific question, which is very concise. Did you know that the Kane Commission, the official government commission, did not even mention the number 7 World Trade Center, a 47-story building, collapsed at 5:20 p.m. on 9/11/01 without being hit by a plane, taller than any building in Maryland or Virginia? It wasn't mentioned, and the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't mention that it wasn't mentioned.
Yeah, and there's some excellent books and some excellent DVDs and films on that whole subject, including the one that shows that there were never a plane shown crashing into the Pentagon, which haven't gotten around very much. I wish they'd get around more. You know, I don't really like to speculate on things I don't know much about, and I don't know, you know a lot more about that than I do. And I like to talk about things I really know about. I know there's a lot of there are films around, but they're not getting wide circulation.
I work with 911truth.org. That's a good place to start.
911truth.org. Yeah, go to it. And the other thing is, you know, it has struck me that if someone were to rob the bank down the street here tomorrow, probably the first thing the police would do would be to look for an inside job, right? But it's, you know, like, I was in the Amazon on 9/11, and shortly after that I went up to Ground Zero, and I was amazed when I came back from the Amazon as I'm driving out. I flew into the Miami airport and I was driving up to my home in another part of Florida, and listening, and I was expecting to hear people talking about, well, let's look at who really did this. But even on NPR, you know, and on every radio station, I didn't hear any of that. And as I said, I don't know anything about 9/11 really and what really happened there, but I'm amazed by the lack of true investigation that seems to have gone into that. It just appalls me because it really, coming from where I come from, it's extremely difficult for me to believe that that whole thing was masterminded by a man living in a cave with a walkie-talkie.
Thank you so much.
But I don't know. Thank you. All right. Well, can I just bring us to a quick close? So just as we're closing, and maybe we can get your questions at the table out there where we're here, where we're signing, whatever. I just want to remind you all that changes do occur, and I'd like to leave you with this thought. And they occur because people become determined to change consciousness. And so we'd just like to say that together, all of us here together, and all of our friends and all of our communities around, we must do the right thing. We must do the rational thing, the smart thing, the pragmatic thing. We must. We must do this. We must change this world. We must transform our corporations. We must change this world. We must create a world that will be safe for our children and their children, and one that they will be proud to inherit from us. So let's go out and do that, and I thank you very much.
We've had a lot of creative thinking going on in this room tonight, which I think is going to change a lot of lives. So I thank John Perkins so much for that. He will sit up here now. He'll sign. If people will help us fold up the chairs, please, and line up to my left-hand side. The line is going to be on this side.
Yeah, I'm going to try and get up too. Yeah.
Here, come on.
Deviation from the script here. The book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, basically covers world history from World War II until post 9/11. And tonight I'm really going to focus on 4 points about that history and also leave some time for questions and answers. So I'll try to move rapidly through this. But those points are: 1, since World War II, we've managed to create history's first truly global empire. 2, this has been done by the corporatocracy, which are a few men and even a fewer women who run our major corporations, and in doing so also run the United States government and many other governments around the world. The corporatocracy has created this world empire primarily in secret. Most of us haven't been aware of it because it's been done through economics rather than, like most other empires, through the military. The military only comes in as a last resort. 3, we in the United States have managed to go against all of our own principles in this process, and we've turned what people at the end of World War II saw as the great savior of democracy, the United States, into an empire that's feared by millions of people around the planet. Those are the bad 3 points. The 4th point is the good news. The good news is that today we find ourselves living in a highly integrated planet, a highly interconnected world, and we have all of the resources at our disposal necessary to bring peace and prosperity to future generations. So tonight, I'd like to focus on the good.
He takes you inside the world of global finance in his memoir, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is an hour, 15 minutes.
I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the owners here at Politics and Prose. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce John Perkins on the occasion of the publication of the paperback of his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is a book that really kind of snuck up on us. It was published about 2 years ago by a very high-quality business book publisher, Barrett Kohler, out on the West Coast. We started stocking a couple of copies. 2 or 3 months later, we were stocking a half dozen copies. A month later, we were stocking a dozen copies. And then it was a true word-of-mouth book that just kept growing and growing. And then to everybody's surprise, but not the surprise of the people who had read the book, all of a sudden there it was on the New York Times bestseller list. So it's the kind of thing, growth of a book that we'd like to see in the book business. It's hardly propelled by big corporate advertising. It was a true word-of-mouth book. Okay, John Perkins was born of good, solid New England stock. He went to Middlebury College. He graduated with all that right kind of altruism, idealism. He had an uncle by marriage who worked for the National Security Agency, who suggested to him that he go into the Peace Corps, which seemed exactly the right path for
Good news. The fourth, I'm an economist, so I don't count too well. It's a benefit, you know, if you're an economist, don't learn to count. Tonight we will focus on the good news, on the smart, realistic, and pragmatic things each of us can do, you and I, what each of us can do to turn this world around. When you leave here, I believe you will feel absolutely confident that we, you and I, will do the right thing, and that together in the next few years, we will become the kind of country that our children will be proud to inherit from us. I think we have the prospect to do it, and we're going to do it. And I would just like to mention that I started talking like this, talking about this book last November, a year ago, a little over a year ago, when the hardback came out. And I saw very different faces. People were not nearly as aware a year ago as we are today with what's going on with the National Security Agency, the agency that trained me, and the exposure about them spying on our own people, what we know about Latin America, and so many other things. Things have changed a lot in this last year, and I take complete credit for it. Before I go into this good news that I see coming, I'd like to address some questions that I'm sure a lot of you have. It's how did we get here? How did this happen? And how did it happen so secretly? And what are economic hitmen anyway? And where do they come from? And of course, all of these things are addressed in lots of detail in the book, so I ought to stop talking now and let you buy the book. But I'll go into it a little bit.
Cultures against the inroads of the oil companies who are coming in, trying in whatever way they can. And John Perkins knows all the tactics because he's used them in the past. But he's there now to preserve rather than to spoil. So here's John Perkins.
Thank you. Did you want this? Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Politics and Prose. It's great to be at an independent bookseller. And thank you, all of you. It's deeply touching to see so many of you standing around out there. I'm very gratified and feel very honored to be here with you tonight. I feel especially moved by being in this capital city, and yesterday I spent some time wandering around the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial and other places, and I've always been tremendously touched by what Thomas Jefferson had to say, and Tom Paine and others. And as I wandered around this great city yesterday, seeing these places and reading the inscriptions, I was so deeply moved at what an incredible opportunity you and I, each of us here, has right now, because we're at a time that's not unlike the 1770s, when the world is on the verge of a new revolution, and we're going to lead it into that revolution and make this a better world for my daughter and all of her brothers and sisters on every continent on this planet. And I'm very hopeful that we'll do that. And seeing all of you here tonight gives me great, great hope. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Young man who was idealistic, and he did. He went to the Amazon. It was something that just fired his imagination. So the great question for all of us, which we're going to hear about tonight, is how can a young man who starts out with such high ideals be seduced and subverted into a career that involves a lot of subterfuge, deviousness, and just a lot of activities that he would never, I think, 10 years earlier have ever said that he was going to be involved in. Then once he got into it, he was told that there was no way that he was going to get out of it. He couldn't get out of it unless that he was going to risk his life. Well, he did get out of it, and he lived to tell the tale, and this is the tale that he tells. It's a world which very few of us know. We're going to hear all tonight about what an economic hitman is. It's not a pretty story, but it will make a lot of things that you read in our newspapers about what is going on in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Indonesia. It will make a lot more sense. So here's John Perkins to tell us all about this. And I should say one more thing, and that is now he's come full circle. He's back to working in the Amazon. He's working with indigenous peoples there to help them preserve their